So now we're coming to the last but definitely not least point, and I already outlined this morning in the lineup. The last session of today will be about a very controversial issue, and we wouldn't have talked about that issue last year. I already mentioned this morning. It's about the conventional weapon topic in a changing global geostrategic and political environment. It's a very complex topic, and it's very actual, unfortunately. And fortunately, I could persuade a colleague of us and a member of the ESG Commission, Jan Westring, who we are very familiar with for more than a decade, because he always participated not just in EFFAS conferences, but also for more than a decade in the EFFAS summer school. And therefore, we are very well familiar with him and his Swedish colleagues. And while we were elaborating on this topic, we were coming to this setup, and there are two people who are joining. It's Jan and Jan, so to speak, and we start with Jan Westring, and he is Senior Portfolio Manager. He works for the Swedish Pension Agency, so he's well familiar with a huge AP program we all know from 1 to 7. And also, he's very well familiar with EFFAS and our work, because he's an active member of the ESG Commission. And without any further ado, Jan, welcome. We are glad to have you, and perhaps you start, and then I introduce Jan P. and his presentation in the second go. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frank. As you said, this is a very, very difficult and broad topic with several moral issues. And I would like to start to talk about the consideration and the different thoughts you can have as an asset manager if you invest in the defense industry, or if you not invest. See, you can take the next here. Yeah, I'll try to. Oh, sorry. Here, why do we have this discussion right now in Sweden and Finland, and why don't we have that before? As you know, the Russian attacked the Ukraine on February 24th and shocking the world. But despite the shock, the Western countries managed to act together against Russia. And as a consequence of this, Sweden and Finland have applied for membership in Nato. So, you know maybe that all the 30 NATO states must ratify the application, and so far 23 NATO countries have ratified the application. So what about the war from the Russian perspective? If you as a Russian sits in the Kremlin and put your glasses on and see what's happened in the former sphere of interest, you will see the major expansion of NATO since 1990 until today. The former allied states has been your, so to say, enemies. So that's one question. And interesting is that Russia had a major military exercise with Belarus in September last year, called Zapad, which means West in the Russian language. 200,000 soldiers participate. So after that, Russia came with the proposal to NATO and said so here, that NATO would not further expand its presence eastwards. And NATO must remove all troops in the countries that become members after 1997, which are 12 of the current NATO members today. And also the third one, NATO would not hold exercises in Ukraine. That was quite funny, I think. Then came the war, as you know, the 24th of March. The Western countries united sent weapons to Ukraine, and Sweden, for instance, it was actually after 3 days was prepared to send weapons to Ukraine. And Sweden have never sent weapons since the Second World War, and then we sent the weapons to Finland. And the Swedish states never broke the stance that we for decades had in Sweden, that Sweden may not export weapons to warring countries. Here on the picture we see the First Lady Olena Zelensky. She speaks in the US Congress and asks for weapons. And I think that she's very, very skilled describing why a country needs weapons. She's asking for weapons, not just for war, but to protect one's home and the right to wake up alive in that home. So, what about the investment strategy with or without the defense industry? What will be the effect if we exclude defense industry in our asset management? Yes, here we can see a graph. The blue one is the FTSE Euro aerospace and defense sectors, comparing that to FTSE Euro 300. And as you see, it's a significant overperformance if you have this year invested in the defense sector. And also if you see what's happening in the States, this is S&P 500 aerospace and defense sector, and there is a big difference in performance if you have put your money in the defense sector. When you want to screen weapons for investments, then you need to decide which type of controversial weapons you want to exclude. And this is the points that we do in the Nordic, and especially in the Swedish country. As you know, there's a various of ESG consultants over there which do screenings, and this is a company called Clarity that we use. And this is also the controversial sectors that we screen and don't invest in. And we have actually a threshold of 5% of those companies as well that we don't put in our portfolio. And if you, as we are a global investor, we invest in have global equities. If you exclude weapons of any type, this is what's happened. 3% of the index is disappearing, corresponding to 80 companies. But if you exclude just nuclear weapons, it's 20 companies, and controversial weapons, just 8 companies. But the thing is that normally the most of the companies that are doing conventional weapons are also doing controversial weapons. So you need to do an exclusion analyst, walk through the company, see exactly what they are doing, and is it controversial, and what kind of weapon producer are there. More and more, as mentioned, like as you know, include companies which can achieve to the 17 global goals, FN global goals. But the UN themselves claims that by excluding companies which consist of production and distribution of weapons, you can achieve the 70 global goals. But is it actually true today? As we have learned the last half year, the most important task for a state or a country is actually to protect freedom, peace, and security. So that's very, very hard question to ask. If you believe or agree in this, you can invest at least in one of these UN SDGs. Maybe you can invest in this number 16. This is a picture and an example also from the Swedish weapon producer Saab. Saab is known for the fighter jets and anti-tank weapons. And they claim that if you can invest in Saab, you can also achieve 8 of the 17 global goals. But here's a moral question as well. Sweden sent weapons to Ukraine, but Saab is actually not allowed to take orders direct from Ukraine, because the Swedish legislation is very restrictive. But this time the politicians have changed their attitude, and they can change it back again. So it's hard to say exactly what they're meaning. And talk about treaty and conventions. This is a quite funny picture. When Sweden signed the Ottawa Treaty on the prohibition of anti-personnel mines, we didn't scrap the mines we had. We just changed the name from troop mine to defense mine. So that's a way of doing this as well by the different countries, or the defense from the different countries as well. So what about the Swedish asset managers? Have they changed their investment goals or policies due to the war and due to the application to NATO? The answer is, if you start with the government-owned asset managers in Sweden, so you know the AP funds, we have 7 of them. So they, just before the war and after the war, and right now, we can say that we can invest in companies that comply with the international convention that Sweden has signed. And for my stake, my company, the Swedish Pension Agency, we still don't invest in weapons. And weapons, it means both conventional weapons and controversial weapons. But with the war, discussion has started in Sweden and the rest of Europe. Is weapons necessary evil in order to be able to defend democracy, freedom and independence of the countries? So I hear, but haven't seen, but more and more asset managers that previously excluded the defense industry have changes the mindset and start to include some of the weapon producer. I have here a quote from one of the AP funds that is just covering what I'm saying right now. Ukraine war has raised many questions for investors. Yes, we know that. And one example is, are the defense industry can it be responsible and sustainable? And they said that it's possible to make responsible and sustainable investments in the defense industry, but you need to choose the different companies you are investing in. That's the main most important thing. And here also, what about the Swedish banks? The Swedish banks here, Aedsd have changed the policy regarding the Swedish weapon producer Saab. The thing is that we in Sweden only have one quoted defense stock, and that's Saab. And the Swedbank has also changed its policy regarding that sort of companies. But the rest of the companies, the rest of the banks, the Svenska Handelsbanken, Nordea and Danske Bank, has not changed its policy. But Danske Bank actually accepts weapons for that they are necessary for achieving peacekeeping missions, for instance. So everyone is just slipping on these questions, but it's going to be very interesting next year to see if and how and what the different investors has done, and are they changing the investment policy? That's my big question for the coming year. Yeah, I'll stop here.
And thank you very much for this presentation and gives us an overview about how the Nordic countries do think about this very controversial topic, and especially also from the Swedish point of view. We will come back with questions in the Q&A part of it. And I would like to change now to Jan P, because he will give us a more detailed view on the sector as a whole. Jan is the Secretary General for Aerospace and Defense Industries Association of Europe, Aesd. And as we are all obviously not that familiar with, I'll just give you some additional information. And the Association of Europe is the voice of a sector representing more than 3,000 companies of all sizes from 18 European countries. The combined turnover of these 3,000 companies exceed 230 billion euros, and the number of direct employees exceed 870,000 people. Yeah, this gives you an idea, and Aesd actively supports the competitive development of the industries in Europe by advocating common positions and providing technical expertise to international standards used worldwide by industry, customers, governments, and international organizations such as the Nato. Yeah, and I think having said that, it becomes pretty clear that this is a very important organization where we obviously are not that familiar with, Jan, so therefore we are really glad to have you here, and I would like you to hand over and give us your presentation, because from what I saw at first glance, that's at least as important and impressive to what Jan already outlined from the asset manager point of view. Please, Jan, go ahead.
So thank you very much. I hope that you can hear and see me. I would have put a high pleasure in being with you in Vienna today, but unfortunately it didn't work out, and I am joining you from a hotel room in Portugal as we speak. Having said that, thank you for the introduction, and I will just start sharing my presentation and see hopefully that could work so that you get it on the screen. So here we go. I was already introduced. I have one key message to all of you today, and I think I will start with that because all of the rest of the presentation is really supposed to lead that key message into evidence. So my key message here today is that if access to finance for the defense industry is being made more difficult for different reasons, such as taxonomy, ESG criteria, etc., it would be counterproductive to the policy statements of all EU member states and all EU institutions. So what I'm saying is basically the leaders, the political leaders of the EU and all of its member states do not wish to see a challenge with access to finance for the defense industry for a number of reasons. And now this is obviously something that one could debate. What does that mean, and how can you avoid having challenges with access to finance? But I'll come back to a couple of these issues in the presentation. But first of all, before putting that into evidence, that statement, it's a bold statement. Before putting it into evidence, I will give you some background in order to better understand why the policymakers are making these kind of statements these days. So this is the content of the presentation, shortly about Aesd. Most things has been said, but I will also touch upon a global outlook for the industry as a whole, for Europe as a whole, because it matters. We need to think about the European defense industry as a part of Europe and Europe as a part of the global scene. So what does the overall outlook look like? I'll touch briefly upon that, and then I'll touch upon what has happened with the ESG criteria, taxonomy, eco-label, etc., and the policy shifts that are now coming. So let's get on to it. And it was already mentioned the geographical scope of Aesd. So I won't touch further upon that, but this presentation is obviously something that you can have and distribute afterwards. So maybe it's nice that the slide is in there anyway. And by the way, here you can see our direct company members at the bottom of the slide, and you can see the different national associations on the two sides of this slide. The numbers were also touched upon, and maybe just to say that here we can split also the numbers to see how many of the employees are directly involved in the civil aeronautics business and how many in the defense business. But what is important to know is, of course, these numbers of direct jobs relate only to the people being directly employed in the companies represented by Aesd. So the actual number of jobs created around this industry is by far bigger than what is on this slide. So this is where I think it starts. My message to you would start hopefully to get a little bit more interesting. Oops. What you can see here is at the pace of which the economic shift from the West to the rest, to use a little bit of a worn out expression, is actually happening. You can see on this slide the darker colors, you have Europe and you have the US, and here you can see that in the 1980s to 1990s, Europe and US accounted for 75% of the global GDP. You can also see that in a forecast towards 2041 to 2050, roughly around the mid-century here, we would be accounting together with Europe and US for less than 50%, somewhere around 45%. And all of this is at the expense of the growth in especially Asian countries, Asia Pacific. So this is a dramatic change of power when it comes to GDP, and all the financial houses are pointing at the same thing. Whether you speak about the Economist, as we speak here, Economist intelligence unit behind these numbers, or PricewaterhouseCoopers or any other actor, you can find differences on details, but not on the bigger trends. And obviously all of this being as a result of the demographic shifts and trends that are being produced by the United Nations. So having said that, if we think about a statement very often put forward that the US and the European industry, generally speaking, are global leaders, this is true, but it's based on investments in the past, and it's based on a situation where there were very few other competitors. Now looking ahead, the biggest economists won't be found in Europe or US. This is also clear. And what is driving the competitiveness for the future is obviously investments in R&D, etc., the market, the demand side. So what that we need to take into account that Europe is about to lose 1/3 of its relative size as of today versus 2050, and how to deal with that when it comes to defense. So what does this mean, particularly this change, if you look into the defense sector? I changed my slide. I can't see that it has changed on your side. Yes, now it did. So here you see a number of different circles. I don't know in the room whether you can see the details behind it, but they are supposed to be a reflection of the size of the defense budgets by 2020. And the different countries in the world. A couple of comments on this one. The relative size of the circle is supposed to reflect the size of the budget in the respective country. The blue one obviously being the US budget, the red dot, second biggest here, being the Chinese budget, and then you have numerous other countries. Couple of interesting comments. First of all, on the staples that you can find to the right of the slide, you can see that there are only 16 countries on this slide, and still it covers more than 95% of the global defense budget. So when you speak about the global market, we need to realize, first of all, if you know 16 countries on the defense side, then you know the global market. It's not bigger than that when it comes to money. Secondly, if you consider that China, first of all, a comment maybe on how much these countries need to invest of their GDP to be at this level. The US is invested some 3.5% of their GDP to be at this level of defense investments, $738 billion in 2020. So 3.5% of their GDP is invested to be there. The Chinese are investing 1.7% of their GDP to be at the level where they are now. And this level where they are now is roughly the same level as the combined or aggregated EU investments in defense. So China today is as big as Europe at equal level, but with the difference that China only is investing 1.7 and has an extremely sharp growing trend in terms of its growth of GDP in general, which means that by 2050, if we look at these forecasts, what do they mean? By 2050, the Chinese economy is by PPP, Purchasing Parity Index. The Chinese economy is foreseen to be 50% bigger than the US economy. And should the Chinese by then also want to increase the proportion of their GDP that they invest in on the defense side from 1.7 to maybe 3.5 or 4% or something, you would easily get a red dot being as big as the blue dot or even bigger. And this outnumbers, of course, the European budgets by far. So if you put Europe in a context, this is the European defense spendings since 1960 until 2020. We speak about 6 decades with decreasing defense budgets. I touch upon that because you need to realize that it's really the investments in defense that is driving the competitiveness. This is what, at the end of the day, is telling you whether you would have future systems, future products that can compete on the global market with the competing capabilities or capacities. And this trend is obviously not looking that attractive. So let's put it into a global comparison. And here you see the US trend. Now, unfortunately, these slides are not accurately from the perspective that they cover different time periods. So this time period here is 1990 to 2020, so 30 years, 3 decades. And here you can see the US defense spendings constantly increasing. This is the top curve. Then you can see the bottom curve is the Chinese, and the middle one is Europe. Europe being relatively flat over this time period. The Chinese coming obviously from almost nowhere as compared to Europe, coming up to the same level roughly as we speak, 2015, 2020, we are at the same level, but the Chinese economy is forecasted to grow by far quicker than the European, and the Chinese are increasing their defense spendings, their defense budgets by far quicker than we are. So the trends here are alarming. Then, okay, so let's realize that Europe is about to become a much smaller, relatively speaking, smaller actor on the defense scene. Then, of course, it would be extremely important that we spend our money wisely. But is that the case? And this slide is showing you to what extent Europe is working together, meaning collaborative projects, procurement, development, R&D, etc. And this slide is unfortunately also a little bit old. It's 2016. Should it have been 2020, we would have had a total defense expenditure roughly around 200 billion. But the size of these collaborative would have been roughly at the same level where they are now. So basically saying the message here is that Europe is working through national supply lines when it comes to defense. There is a very little component of collaborative development. And of course, if you become a smaller and smaller player constantly due to the macroeconomical developments, and you insist on being unable to cooperate, of course, this will increase the speed of which Europe becomes less competitive. So this slide, I call it the sickness of the system, the illness of the European collaboration. And now I'm coming to what are the policymakers doing about that? This is the European Defence Fund. I don't know how familiar you are with this fund, but this is an 8 billion euros fund that was launched 2021. It had a couple of precursors. There was a preparatory action for defense-related research. There was a defense development investment fund, etc., as precursors to learn how to do this. But the European Defence Fund is a game changer. It's a milestone from the perspective that the European Commission is moving from being only a regulator to also be a customer. So the Commission is investing EU money into collaborative projects that spans over all of the different phases, from research and development until market uptake. And it's not the Commission paying everything. The Commission is seeing this as an incentivizer, as a catalyst. So you can have 20% of the overall cost can come from the Commission, and the rest would have to come from the collaborating member states. However, my message to you is that there is a lot, in order to put in place a European Defence Fund, where you take collective European money to incentivize collaboration on the defense side, there is an enormous push. This would never have happened without the support of all European member states and the Commission, and realizing how severe the global situation for the European defense industry really is. So this is the first evidence that policymakers are indeed investing in the defense sector and the European defense industry, and wanting to make sure that it can survive and stay competitive for tomorrow. And what has happened then is, obviously, we touched upon already by previous speakers. We've had the war, but already before the war, what we saw were two initiatives driven by the European Commission, and we've seen a number of national initiatives as well. We've seen the initiative of the taxonomy file, and we've seen the eco-label file. Now, both of these initiatives at the European level are currently stopped. None of them are moving as we speak. And the reason why they're not moving is obviously that there were early indicators that defense should be seen as something that should be excluded due to ESG criteria. Different levels of defense engagement in the eco-label fund. I think they spoke about more than 5% of defense of the turnover of a company coming from defense, and then the company would have to be excluded in a fund. And taxonomy was sort of trying to pack defense together, or group defense together with child labor, with alcohol, with pornography and things like that, saying this is not a sustainable activity. And as these files were being prepared in the European Commission at a lower level, obviously the financial market actors took that as a reason to really reconsider, should we be stuck with this kind of when this taxonomy is coming, when this eco-label is coming, should we be stuck with this kind of companies in our investment portfolios or customer relationships, etc. And we have seen the financial market actors during 2 years turning the defense industry its back. So this takes different shapes. We have banks saying no to loans, saying no to guarantees, even ending long-lasting customer relationships with the defense companies, simply because they are in the defense sector. And we've seen institutional investors trying to get rid of their part of defense companies in their different investment portfolios. And we've seen the same on the retail side. So we've seen everybody more or less trying to decrease their interface towards the defense sector, which is in total contradiction with the defense fund, because this is now then, if you want to ensure that you have a competitive defense industry, an effective way to counter that would obviously be to make sure that this sector does not have access to finance. So what has happened then is that we've made this very clear. We brought this up to the attention of prime minister level in different member states, of president level in different European institutions, notifying them that what is the effect of these initiatives that are ongoing at the EU level? Is this really aligned with what you are trying to achieve at the top level? Because we seem to think that this is very counterproductive. And as an effect of that, there has been a number of statements coming from the European Commission. And we have been informed, this is why I dare to say it to you as well, that the taxonomy will not move forward, the eco-label will not move forward in any way that would be detrimental for the access to finance for the defense industry. This was already, I mean, my key message here is on bullet point number 1, already before the war in Ukraine, the top level of politicians in member states and EU institutions invested heavily in the defense sector because they know what lies around the corner for the coming decades. This is why we have the European Defense Fund, why we have PESCO, why we have the Military Mobility Fund, etc. What has happened with the Ukraine war is that this has become a further catalyst to put defense really as a political priority. It has led to a shift in perception. This is true, as has been said. It has also led to an increasing demand of production of defense equipment, because we need to replenish all the stocks for those countries that has delivered equipment to Ukraine, and we need to be prepared for a long time war, which means that we need also to be able to ramp up production to refill those stocks and to also deliver what is needed when the different member states are now realizing that their defense budgets has been too low and they want to increase them. So when it comes then to these policy instruments, on the 15th of February, the European Commission came out with an official public communication highlighting, as it's stated here, initiatives on sustainable finance remain consistent with the European Union's efforts to facilitate the European defense industry's sufficient access to finance and investment. So here they are saying for the first time, we need to make sure that we are not countering ourselves with these transversal activities that are going on in the European Commission. And this has then continued on the 11th of March, where we had the heads of states meeting in Versailles. This also led to a statement that is similar to the one that I just read. But this one points out even also by making best use of the possibilities of the European Investment Bank. So now the Commission is also looking into can we make better use of the European Investment Bank? And as you know, they have an exclusion for defense in their lending portfolio, which is heavily questioned now whether this makes sense or not. And on the 21st of March, the EU Strategic Compass, which is really the document that outlines everything in terms of strategy for European defense. This is a quote from that compass. Important to ensure that horizontal EU policies, such as initiatives on sustainable finance, remain consistent with the European Union's efforts to facilitate the European defense industry's sufficient access to public and private finance and investments. So when I told you at the beginning, my key message is that the politicians want to, at the top level, member states, institutions, ensure that there is no taxonomy, there is no eco-labeling that would go against the interest of access to finance for the defense industry. These are the evidence slides for that. And this is the reason why the taxonomy and the eco-label files has been stopped at the Commission as we speak. My last slide, I would, of course, want to say that from our perspective, and this is what we stress a lot as well, we think that the ESG criteria has been taken a bad turn from the beginning, or a bad starting point. We believe, as Jan said here already, we believe that, first of all, as a precondition for anything that has to do with sustainability, you need free and open democracies, you need open societies, you need access to free trade, you need a number of things. You need authorities, agencies that are free from corruption, that are free from being hostile, overtaken, etc. For all of that, the defense industry is part of the solution. You need border control, you need maritime surveillance, you need cybersecurity. All of that, the defense industry is part of the solution. So we would like to turn it around and say the defense industry is de facto a key enabler for any kind of sustainability. Without having the proper ground in a society, you can't develop anything in a sustainable way. On top of it, given what the situation looks like, of course, it's a profitable investment as well. So it should be attractive from that perspective. So I guess I would stop here. I hope that there would be questions maybe, and I'm happy to take any of them. I am, as said, being Secretary General, I'm not a specialist on ESG, but I can take any sort of overarching and strategic questions around this. So thank you very much for listening.
And thank you very much. Very impressive, actually. And I was just wondering whether there are questions here from the audience or the online audience.
First of all, thank you very much for very clear presentations and ESG criteria impact on the investment targets in defense industries. I would like to make a comment to the first presentation made by first speaker. First of all, thank you very much for quoting the wife of our president, Mrs. Olena Zelenska. But before this, you showed the slide with the date of 21st of March. I don't know if it's misprint, because the Russian aggression against Ukraine started on 21st of February. Or you would like to tell with this date something else? Thank you very much.
No, actually, it's misprint from the beginning. That's all that. That's correct.
Any further questions, opinions, statements? Then perhaps from our side, a question perhaps to Jan. How do you see the reaction within the other NATO or EU members concerning conventional weapons going forward? Perhaps it's a question to both of you, but I think also especially from the portfolio management point of view, because when I do share views here with our colleagues from Austria, Switzerland, France, and what have you, we are still relatively reluctant, obviously because we don't have any direct frontier, and so your situation is totally different. Therefore, you made this incredible move from being a neutral country for more than 50 years then to joining the NATO. So therefore, I was just wondering, when you have the background also of the AP programs, how this was being received.
No, as I told you in the beginning, that I believed when I started to do this presentation that many have done shift in the investment policies, but they are I don't know if you could call it confused. They don't still have decide which leg they're going to stand on. If they're going to use or change their investment policies, or keep it like this. But I think there's going to be a big, it's starting, continue to big debate. And also when I called around my colleagues in the different other asset management firms here in the Nordic countries, they said that, okay, we're thinking about it, we discuss it every day, but we haven't made any decision yet. But probably it will come the coming month or half a year or so on. And we'll see what will happen, and also what will happen when we maybe start to invest in the defense industry that we haven't done before.
Thanks, Jan. Then perhaps a question to Jan P. As your organization entails activities within 18 countries, do you expect an upcoming discussion about this whole conventional weapon matter in the public opinion of the different NATO countries going forward, and then also perhaps a change in underlying opinion?
So thanks for the question. I do indeed expect that there will be a discussion both internal within industry, within NATO, as well as a public discussion. My feeling, generally speaking, the discussion has started on many fronts, on many levels. My feeling, generally speaking, between European industry, US industry, NATO, European and US investors, I think can be summarized by saying that, first of all, it seems that on the NATO side and on the US side, there is no contradiction whatsoever. European defense industry. On the contrary, NATO would only be as strong as the NATO members allows it to be, and Europe playing many EU member states playing an important part, being NATO members, can only contribute with what they have in terms of capabilities. So it's only from the NATO perspective, it's only foreseen to be a good move if the willingness to invest in the European defense industry is coming back again. On the investor side, I can see that this move that we've had in Europe with financial actors turning their backs towards the defense industry, it is a European phenomenon. phenomenon. It doesn't happen in the US. It doesn't happen anywhere else. And I spoke to my colleague, Mr. Eric Fanning, who is the president of AIA, the counterpart in US organizing the US defense industry. And just to ask him whether the US industry had experienced anything like we do in Europe right now, and he said, no, absolutely not. However, he was very pleased that I informed him about what is happening in Europe, because his feeling was that this is very much NGO driven, what is happening, and NGOs very often operate from the perspective that they try to get a major achievement in one region in the world, and when they've done that, they move to the next one. So he took it as an alarm signal, but he also confirmed that he would be pretty sure that US investors would be happy to fill the gap in terms of access to finance on the European side if the European investors wouldn't come back to the defense industry.
Great, thank you very much. And please perhaps allow me for a last question to Jan Westring from a portfolio management point of view. Do you expect institutional international investors to be proactive concerning that topic, or do you think they are going to wait for good till the opinion or action and activity of their respective administration would have changed?
I think the question is yes on the both questions, but it's so interesting when I started to discuss during the different conference this topic, because we are not, as I told you, we are not investing in weapon or the defense industry right now. But the pros and cons when I discuss it, I have so many mails coming in from other asset manager firms that would like to have a discussion, because everyone is actually having the discussion. What should we do with this? Should we claim it as a sustainable investment or not? Because they haven't done it historically, especially in Sweden, because the Swedish church actually 2005 or even previously that said that no, the defense industry is not sustainable. That's why we are so negative for defense industry in especially in Sweden, but also the other Nordic countries. But there coming more and more discussions, and I think it's going to take probably some bigger asset manager, if they start to change their mind officially, then I believe that the smaller firms also going to add also the weapon industry or the defense industry into the portfolios or the different funds they managed.
Thank you, Jan. We have one question from the audience here in Vienna.
Thank you. From a lawyer's point of view, it was very interesting for me in the last minutes that we were all, or you were all only talking about defense weapons. But from my question would be, in the defense weapons, are there also controversial weapons? Because maybe this could be the point if the transparency. For me, it's not quite clear what kind of weapons, because, for example, we as Aesd Group, we excluded corporates which are producing controversial weapons. But for me, it was not clear here if the defense industry also have that kind of weapons.
So thank you for the question. If I may pop in and try to answer it. Indeed, first of all, when it comes to weapons, there is no clear internationally signed treaty that everybody has agreed upon on which weapons that are controversial and which ones that are conventional. So there are a number of treaties, and all of these different treaties are ratified by different member states, but there is no one single treaty identifying exactly that everybody has agreed upon. However, having said that, it's easy to single out a number of controversial weapons, and to exclude defense industries dealing with controversial weapons would be absolutely fine for the European defense industry. We are not a supporter of controversial weapons. However, what is often popping up in the discussion as well is weapons, defensive weapons. Would it be easier to invest in defensive weapons? And this is a much more tricky question, because a weapon is really not defensive or offensive. This is the same weapon. It's just a matter of how it is being used and for what purposes. And use the tanks like the Ukrainians are doing to defend themselves, or you can use the tanks as the Russians are doing to invade another country. So there is nothing like defensive or offensive weapons that would have a clear and decisive line, but controversial weapons, European industry very much support that this could be excluded, absolutely.
Great, thank you very much, Jan. Yeah, I want to thank you, both of you, because I think that was a very interesting topic, and I think we have discussed about this for the first time on EFFAS level on ESG, but I'm really sure that this wasn't the last time. Therefore, I'm glad that we could win both of you for this very interesting presentation, and also for the upcoming discussion, which is really worthwhile. And as we have seen during the last 3 or 4 questions, a lot of things which has been really clear, or seem to be really clear in the past, are now at least up for discussions. And I think from a European point of view, we should pretty much do this in order to make up our mind how to go forward with that. So thank you very much for both of you, and to both of you. And let's talk about this in future, and let's continue. And thank you very much for your effort, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So now I would like to hand over to my dear colleague, Jean-Philippe Desmartins, to give a wrap-up of today's 7 sessions.